Hello again, we're back, and in this video lecture, we're going to be discussing ICD-10 PCS procedures for cancer or neoplasms, as it says in the material. And these surgical procedures are involving these root operations. Please make sure that you're clear on the differences between these root operations. The difference between an excision, a resection, or destruction. Excision is cutting out or off without replacement a portion of a body part. This is different than a resection, which is removing the entire body part. We can do excisions for a couple of different things. They can be done for a diagnostic procedure. And then again, we would use qualifier X to indicate that the biopsy is a diagnostic procedure. A resection is taking out the entire body part. And this is, say, the types of things that we think about with the radical prostatectomies, the mastectomies, what have you. Things are being entirely removed. And again, something that we find a lot of people that are new to PCS coding doing is that they're not able to distinguish between the difference between a excision and a resection. Destruction is the physical eradication of all or a portion of a body part by the direct use of energy, force, or destructive agent. This could also be done with the heat, cold, laser therapy, or chemical that we see sometimes dermatologists using. In this case, we don't have any tissue being submitted to the pathology department for analysis because the tissue's actually been destroyed. And then something that we saw somewhat similar is anti-neoplastic chemotherapy. This is infusion, right? So again, the root operation in this case would be introduction. This would be coded from the administrative section, not the medical surgical section. And the main term is introduction of substance in or on. The subterm would say where the infusion is being introduced. Typically, this is a vein, either the central, as we've seen in our chapter 4 examples, or the peripheral. And the approach is percutaneous as the needle is introduced into the vein through the skin. The coder must review the medication administration record or the infusion record and look at the substance being infused and the location of the introduction. In other words, is the introduction of the chemotherapy going through a peripheral vein, a central vein, or through an implantable infusion port using a central vein? All these things can be done, so the documentation, the medication record is key. And that's all I have for you. We'll see you online. Bye now.